Good morning. This is not actually Thursday, January 13th. It's actually Friday, January 14th. And so this is yesterday's lecture. And if you've looked at the notes that I passed out a while ago, I I'm going to divide this discussion up into four lecturoids or lecturettes, just because I'm going to break it up so that I can go back and lie down. And and again, as I mentioned in my notes, I'm not sure that any sentient human being who would wish to remain sentient could listen to more than 15 or 20 minutes of me at a time and still retain his or her sentience. So so here are the four parts and I'll try to do all four of them today. If I don't before 5 o'clock, which is when the Sabbath begins, then I'll probably finish it up on Saturday night and post it then at Sunday morning at the latest. We'll probably meet online on Tuesday morning, Zooming. I've found out, I believe, evidently the condenser mic that I use to make these videos somehow, I don't know if it's an interaction with Windows 11. Don't bother, by the way, with Windows 11. But I did bother. It seems to cut off the speakers in the mic for some reason. So if we Zoom on Tuesday, we'll use my laptop. But I'll let you know between now and then what we're doing. I made a decision to scale back the number of episodes we use in the class because when I fell in love with the series, I guess I wanted I wanted to employ as much of it as possible because I think, as I've told you 3 gazillion times, I think they're very good. But they're also very rich and very complex. And even I, who have seen almost all of these episodes twice now, and sometimes 3 times, still have trouble keeping some of the details straight in my own mind. So I think what I'll do is over the weekend, I'll revise the schedule of our viewings and reduce them. So I know what I'll do is try to pick the best. So anyway, I'll let you know more about that. So the 4 parts. I have to say that one of my favorite movies or series of movies were like the Naked Gun series, Naked Gun Part 1, Naked Gun 2, Naked Gun 33 and a third, the Hot Shots Part 2 series. So this is my parts of this lecture are Part 1, Part B, Part 3, and Part D, just to mix it up. Anyway, so in the first part, I'll discuss the background and characters of the dialogue, who they are, and the setting, and why the question of justice is embedded in their conversation, and why Plato chose these characters in this setting to begin that dialogue about justice. And aside from the identities of the characters, as I put here in my notes, the 2 most important dramatic elements or actions in Book 1 are provided by Thrasymachus. His entry into the dialogue is so uncivil and so violent that Socrates claims to be reduced to terror and tremulousness, and so why is Thrasymachus so angry? And you'll see that question is part of the interpretive unpacking, I think, of what Plato is using Thrasymachus' character for. But then he also provides the second. There are a couple of other important dramatic elements, but let me finish up Thrasymachus because I think these really are the most important. And that is his blushing. At the end of Book 1, as I point out, Thrasymachus is not happy. He's grumbling, he's huffing and puffing, and he's blushed. So, in some ways, he presents himself in this dialogue twice as a red-faced character, one so angry that he can barely contain himself, and the second blushing. Now, I'm going to ask you to reflect on what happens inside of you when you're angry, and what happens inside of you when you blush. What is blushing an indication of? Now, I have to say, the rest of the dramas, the dialogue, is important too. And if this were a full class in ancient political theory, we'd take more time to explore these. Like, for instance, the setting. Socrates and Glaucon are attending a new religious festival down in the Piraeus. And I've not been to Greece or Athens, but actually Athens, which was true at his time, that Athens and the Acropolis, where you can see the Parthenon and many fine 7-Eleven stores in Greek. The Piraeus was about 6 to 8 miles down the hill from Athens towards the ocean and in the port. So the Piraeus would be like where all the sailors and foreigners and resident aliens and prostitutes and unemployed professors would congregate. So in some ways, the opening is, and we probably won't have too much time to explain this, but the interesting thing about the Republic is that Socrates and Glaucon are going to view and participate in a new religious festival. So the Republic, the explicit action of the Republic, begins with a kind of an act of piety. And although we won't be reading this, Book 10 ends with Socrates spinning a myth about how Zeus and the gods reward the just in the afterlife. Now, let me just throw out a speculation. I remember that Socrates was executed by Athens for impiety, for atheism, not believing in the gods of Athens, and also for corrupting the young. Now, I point out in some subsequent comments that, in a way, Plato's Republic is Plato's great response. And by the way, the dialogue, the Apology of Socrates, Apology of Socrates, is apology is a Greek word, and it doesn't mean like what your parents make you do when you slap your younger sister, although it may involve that. Apology is the Greek word for defense. So the literal translation of the name of the dialogue that I referred to in my lecturette yesterday, the Apology of Socrates, literally, which is again is clearly based on the real events of Socrates' real trial. Now, whether or not what Plato reports in his fictional dialogue called the Defense of Socrates is what Socrates actually said, we don't know that, of course. Although there may be a germ of truth, but the point is I think you could say that the Republic in some ways is the real defense of Socrates, because what Plato shows Socrates doing is just the opposite of what Athens accused him of doing, which is corrupting the young. Now, we can talk about what corrupting the young means. I've been doing it for 40 years, and I've gotten pretty good at it, or at least horrifying the young, if not corrupting them. But let's take seriously the notion of corrupting the young. Obviously, it would mean, for instance, what we are tossing around in our political culture is sedition, maybe insurrection. But on one level, like some of the Foyle's War episodes, like where the kids' gangs pull these young men into like looting and stealing. Well, that's corrupting. Well, what does corrupting mean? Not just encouraging young people to violate the law, but rather, doesn't corruption of a young person mean persuading them that there's no such thing as justice or injustice, or that to back up a bit and talk about traditional piety, that there are no gods, or gods don't care, and therefore do what you want. Anybody that says to a young person, do whatever you want, regardless of the consequences, we may disagree about certain actions, etc., but my guess is any of your parents, or you when you become parents, would not want your children to associate with somebody who taught them to be indifferent to right and wrong, good and bad, and who said to them, do what you want, it doesn't matter, anything goes. By the way, if we had more time and I had more power to corrupt you, we'd read some of the ancient philosophers like Epicurus, or the Epicureans, who taught that the good is pleasure. That's why hedon, which is the Greek word for pleasure, and the name of the philosophy that says everything that is pleasurable is good, that the good is pleasure, and therefore if it feels good, do it. As Cicero knew, as Plato and Aristotle knew, and in some ways even as modern philosophers knew, the problem with saying that pleasure is the good, so whatever makes you feel good, do it. It turns out that that's a form of corruption because it culminates in nihilism. Nihil is the Latin word for nothing. So nihilism means that nothing matters. Now, we can talk about the foundations of modern existentialism, that kind of stuff. These are all great and important topics. But all I mean to say is, on one level, my suggestion that what you're really seeing in the Republic is Plato's constructing a dialogue. And again, the dramatic premises of the dialogue are Socrates and Glaucon are going to a new religious festival, and down in the Piraeus, the hot part of town, the Bohemian part of town, the Greenwich Village of Athens, and Polemarchus and Adeimantus, Glaucon and Adeimantus are Plato's brothers. We'll come back to that in a minute. See them from afar, and Polemarchus orders his slave to catch up. And in some ways, it's all very friendly. The mood of the dialogue at the beginning is nobody's complaining about being pushed around. But Polemarchus does make a mild threat of compulsion. And so in some ways, we can't go into this, but many of the great interpreters of this dialogue have made a lot of the fact that the beginning of the dialogue, perhaps like a good deal of political life, starts out with an act of compulsion. Because all politics is power. Whatever else you want to say about Plato, Aristotle, the Bible, and the Tao, and Machiavelli, is everyone agrees politics is power. And as you're going to see, there's a difference between saying politics involves power or rests upon power, as opposed to what Machiavelli and Thrasymachus argue was it's all power. It's all that politics is. Politics is simply exercising power over another human being, which, of course, if you think about it, that's also what parenthood is reduced to. The reason that you obey your parents is because they can beat you up until you can beat them up. And we'll see. I mean, Plato is using Thrasymachus for all kinds of things. He's using all the characters for different views of justice. But Thrasymachus does represent the pure, naked Machiavelli notion that all human life is power, and therefore your task is to get it and use it on others. Do unto others before they can do unto you. So, on one level, to go back to what Socrates is doing in this. So after he's compelled, and remember the dramatic setting of the dialogue is then, okay, Polemarchus forces Socrates friendlily, in a jocular manner, to go back to his house, and then literally the next 10 books are this all-night discussion of justice between Socrates and first an old man, and then some young men, and then the rest. So that's the dramatic premise of the book. But my point here is, I think you can see what Plato is doing, at least in this book, is providing the real defense of his teacher, Socrates. That in some ways even Socrates obviously didn't successfully present his own trial because Athens convicted him and then executed him. So in a way, you could say what Plato has learned is one, as I might have suggested in my lecture yesterday, is first of all, if you're going to raise philosophical questions, don't go around getting everybody on the street angry with you by posing them questions you can't answer. We'll come back to that in a minute, why people hate Socrates. Made fun of him and then killed him. Because you'll see that in some ways, dismissive anger is only a few inches away from dismissive laughter. More about that in a bit. But without going too much into these dramatic details, I don't think it's accidental that Plato begins and ends this dialogue with an opening and closing parenthesis of piety. I'm not suggesting that well, I guess I am suggesting that you'll see from the very beginning, actually, Socrates begins challenging the deepest religious beliefs of the Greeks. But at least you could say, if somebody picked this book up on the street and said, is this one of those damned atheist philosophers again? And if they read it the way that many students read books, which is to skim it from the beginning into the end, and they'd say, well, wait a minute, it starts in a religious celebration, and it ends in a celebration of the eternity of the soul and punishment and reward after death by the gods. Oh, this is a religious book. Well, it turns out that there are profound challenges to what we would call religious faith in here, but nevertheless, the book has a religious face. Now, as you're going to see very quickly, that face gives way to the real agenda of the book, which is to set aside religious beliefs and myths as the grounds of our opinion about justice and to replace it with knowledge. More about that later, of course. So in the first part, I want to talk about as I said, the characters and the dramatic end. I'm not going to talk much about this. We will talk about Thrasymachus's anger and his blushing, which, of course, the point I'm going to make is that the blushing is the facial complexion attached to the element of shame or embarrassment. Not that I've ever been shamed or embarrassment or ever done anything that required shame or embarrassment, but there are some other important dramatic actions in Book 1, which reveal the nature of the characters and the kinds of arguments they make. Just a small mention, by the way. When Socrates pushes Cephalus to the limit of his ability to understand the religious beliefs that he has inherited and is guiding his action, Polemarchus, like a good boy, springs to defend his father and inherit not only his argument. And you're going to see there's a connection between the arguments that Polemarchus makes and who he is in the dialogue. But again, the most important questions are, although you'll see Glaucon and Adeimantos, Plato's real brothers, who carry the bulk of the dialogue beyond Book 1, who they are and what they're doing is also important too. But as you're going to see, I think the most important dramatic action is Thrasymachus. And let me just say, by way of a personal introduction, it's a little ironic. Here I am. When I first encountered this text at Northern Illinois University in 1972, almost 50 years to the day, I was 19 years old, your age, and the age of all the young boys in this dialogue. Now I'm on the brink of retirement. This will be my next to last semester teaching, and I'm about to turn 70. Cephalus's age in the dialogue. So I have to say, my 50 years of encounters with the Republic, I've spanned the whole experience of the characters in it, having been both young, middle-aged, and a nuisance, and now old and on the brink of the grave. As we like to say in English, with one foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel, and that's also Cephalus. So the second part of my second lectureoid, whether it's today or tomorrow night, I'm not sure, will discuss the various turns in the argument in Book 1. In what I've called in the notes, if you're looking at Part B at the top, Socrates' quest to turn the various opinions offered into the beginning of a sketch. Perhaps the word process would have been the better word there. The beginning of a process to sketch out the definition of justice. And in that lecture, I want to talk about, I want to talk about what I talked about yesterday in my lecturette introduction, what the Socratic quest is, the replacement of opinion with knowledge. It turns on the quest for definition. And there are two terms, both in Plato and Aristotle, which you could say become almost identical or identical. I just forgot another word for identical. The same thing, and that is to find the proper definition and to see the idea. So we're going to talk a little bit more in that second lecture about what an idea is and how it seems to be, at least according to most scholars, it's central to Plato's philosophic quest for knowledge of reality, but especially knowledge of human reality, and in this dialogue, of course, knowledge of the true idea of justice. Whether or not that's possible, and whether or not this is all just word games, we'll come back to that question, is a fascinating and interesting question, but at least it'd be fair to say that that's what Plato, embracing Socrates as the character of this dialogue, is portraying. The process of moving up through opinions through the process of weeding out inconsistencies in definitions and false definitions or incomplete definitions, as you'll see, to get at the true definition. Now, what a definition is and what an idea is, we'll come back to that in the second part. Part 3 will provide a summary of what I think Plato is doing in Book 1. That is to say, I've been teaching this text for almost as long as I've been reading it, at least in graduate school to some degree, and certainly as a professor. I think now this would have been the 14th or 15th time I've taught this book at Converse College University. And I formed some ideas about what Plato's doing in this book and what's the function of Book 1. And obviously I couldn't require the entire Republic for our purposes in this course, so I just wanted to have you read enough of the Republic to get a sense of how the Socratic quest for the idea of justice works and what Plato is doing in this dialogue. And I over the years I formulated, I think, 4 answers to the question of what Plato/Socrates is doing. Plato, let's just say, the composer of the dialogue, is doing in this dialogue. Then the fourth part, Part D, will take us through the rest of the Republic, just a sketch of the books, but especially I gave you in the material I passed out the end of Book 4, because technically at the end of Book 4, the dialogue has reached a definition of justice. So we see what justice is. And then in Book 5, some of the most famous parts of the Republic, where Plato or Socrates says to these young boys, he proposes 3 waves of reform which will bring the perfectly just city into being. And it's interesting, as you're going to see, Socrates also calls these 3 waves of reform waves of laughter, because he knows that the young boys, these young Greek boys that he's talking to, think that these things are ridiculous. And as you're going to see, we'll come back to them, and then we'll discuss the last one, important. The first wave of reform is that the abolishing of gender roles. Because if this is a city in which everybody is capable of doing what he's doing, which is to say, it's a just city because everybody is placed in the city according to his or her real capacities, then Socrates pushes this to its consistency and say, well, that means you've got to abandon gender distinctions, because you will find some women who are smarter than some men. I think it may be that most women are smarter than most men. But if that's the case, and justice requires those with the greatest wisdom and reasoning capacity to be the leaders of the city, which you're going to see is the last wave of reform, then you've got to abandon the seemingly natural distinction between men and women, or male and female. So the abolishing of gender roles, which is, by the way, Plato has a reputation among many feminists as the first feminist or proto-feminist because of this daring proposal. The second wave of reform, which is necessary to bring the first into being, is the abolition of the family and private property, pure communism. Those who rule the city, at least, we know in the top class, in the top 2 classes, the rulers and the auxiliary helpers, soldiers, are not going to have private families. They're not going to have spouses. They're not going to have children, their own children, and they're not going to own things. When they look at a particular child in the city, everybody in the city is going to say, this is my child. This is my spouse, my wife, or my husband. And so pure communism, the abolition of the private, which then leads to the third wave of reform, in which Socrates says, by the way, is the funniest and will raise the most laughter, the putting in place of philosophers as the absolute rules of the city. As you're going to see, one of the most famous lines in the Republic is, the woes of humanity will not cease until kings become philosophic or philosophers become kings. I modified the language of this somewhat in my statement as the perfectly just city being brought into being by political science professors being put in absolute charge of everything. Well, we see in this class how that works out. So at any rate, those will be my 4 sub-lectures or lecturoids. So thoughts on, our first lecturoid, which I'll only go for about 5 or 10 minutes because I'm already rambling, on drama and the argument. First of all, note something, and we'll come back to this. Plato's method is not to do as some philosophers have done, modern philosophers like Kant, for instance. If you ever tried to read Kant or Heidegger, or the phenomenologists. It's almost as if they have to reinvent human language with the creation of all kinds of unfamiliar jargon, like the analytical dialectic in Kant, or etc., or the categorical imperative in Kant, which you may be familiar with that term. And yet you'll see that most of the language of the Republic, certainly beginning in book 1, is just everyday language of the street. These are everyday people who have opinions about justice, just like you and I do. So on one level, you could say the attempt of the Socratic quest, the Platonic quest, Socratic conversation on the street, Platonic dialogues in the form of the literary dialogues, is an attempt to start where you and I are. Because after all, if our aim is to know who and what we are, and to know what's good and bad for us, and to know what's right and wrong, then we have to direct our attention to the being that lives those issues out. And you and I live our lives every day, and in fact the discourse we have and the relationships we have with each other are the embodiment, the incarnation, if you want to use a religious term, of our opinions of justice. And so all Socrates is just start with regular people and then ask them their opinion and then proceed to poke holes in it. We'll see more about that in the second part. So who is Socrates? He's a middle-aged man. He's probably in his 40s at this point, as I mentioned in my lecture yesterday. Most scholars think that Socrates is midlife in this. Still about 20 to 30 years older than the boys and 20 to 30 years younger than Cephalus. But what makes him unique, of course, is, as you already know from my introductory lecture yesterday from the Apology, who is Socrates? He's the pest who goes around and asks everybody inconvenient questions. And as the Apology points out, young people like to follow Socrates around because why? Because if I were to tell you, you've had interactions with your parents all your life, and you know if you've had children. Now I haven't had children, but I've watched many of them. So I've had cats. So to my knowledge, I haven't had children. But anyway, I've watched plenty of them: nieces, nephews, friends, etc. And everybody talks about the two stages of rebellion in children, centering around first the word no, which is why the terrible twos are called the terrible twos, because children are just beginning to form linguistic ability, and they're beginning to discover their own power and sense of self, and that's why they love to say no. Now, a few years later, when they're a little more sophisticated, they learn even a more potent challenge to their parents' authority in the form of the word why. Now, I'm sure that all of you have done this, and you all know what the outcome of that chain of conversation is. You have to be back by 10 o'clock on Saturday. Why? Because it's not safe out, and I think it's better for you to be home before it gets too late. Why? And of course, you'll get to the end of that, and you all know what the last line in the conversation is. Because I said so. So on one level, young people follow Socrates around as he asks the city leaders and the poets and the prophets and the religious experts and the businessmen and everyone and parents, like Cephalus. He says he's asking them those questions, and children take a certain pleasure in watching their elders be rendered inarticulate and unable to give a final justification for their commands. And you'll see that there are two exceptions to this. Now, in this, because I said young people generally like the Socratic, watch Socrates dismantle, or to use a word we would use today, deconstruct the authority of parents and elders and authorities in the city, unless it crosses their self-interest. And so, in some ways, Polemarchus, who not only loves his father and respects him and comes to his defense, counter to the pleasure in watching our elders rendered mute and inarticulate by Socratic questioning, but also Thrasymachus, because you're going to see that the problem with Socratic argument is it goes exactly against Thrasymachus' self-interest, even though he too is a young man, brash young man. And that leads me to make another note in the middle of the first page. Socrates was accused from the very beginning of what we could call Socratic irony. Now, if someone's being ironic, there are kinds of different irony. Like we see there's tragic irony. Like if you're a thief and all of a sudden you get caught because the way you steal something falls on you and breaks your leg, it's ironic that your very thieving activity is what led you. So irony, and it's a Greek word, by the way. It's just irene. That's peace, I'm sorry. Ironeia. It just means irony. And what is irony? I guess you could say it's an unexpected turn of events. But when it is applied to Socrates or people who are accused of being ironic, it takes on a quite different meaning. Yes, it means that what you see is not what you get or what is expected. But in the case of accusing somebody, when you say, "Are you being ironic?" it's not just sarcastic. It means you're not being completely honest with me. And so Socrates, from the very beginning, and this was part of the anger and directed against him, and in this by the city, and as you're going to see, I've already answered partially the question of the dramatic question of why Thrasymachus is angry, because people said to Socrates, all you do is ask questions. You don't answer your own questions. And therefore, the point of your questioning isn't to discover the truth as you claim. Rather, it's to humiliate and make fun of people by forcing them to engage in fruitless word games because you're just cleverer at it. So you're actually really just twisting people's words to make you look smarter. That's the full-fledged notion of Socratic irony. And that's pure Thrasymachus, as you're going to see. We'll come back to that. Cephalus. Cephalus is the Greek word for head, like encephalitic. So he's an old man, like I am, on the brink of death, preoccupied with religious piety. Now, you could say, well, what's the connection between his preoccupation with piety and his view of justice as piety, as telling the truth to the gods and paying back debts? And you'll see it's not because he's just close to the grave. I'm pretty close to the grave, but I guess I've stored up so much body mass that I'll actually last for about another 100 years, like a hibernating bear. But as you're going to see, Cephalus is interested in paying back debts and telling the truth, because it turns out it's not just that. Remember, Socrates says, how do you like being old? What's the great thing about being old? And his response is, I like having money. And it turns out his having money, but how did he get the money? It's clear that when he says justice is telling the truth and paying back debts, he's a man in religious terror, because he knows he's led a life of unjust actions, and therefore he's afraid before he dies that if there is life after death and there are gods and there is justice, that he's facing an eternity of punishment. So before he dies, he's become very religious. And you could say either his interest is in appeasing the gods or perhaps bribing the gods by prayer, confession, and sacrifices. I think you could say all of us who have lived a religious life have perhaps seen elements of that behavior in ourselves and in the people around us. So on one level, as you're going to see, it's his fear of being held accountable for his actions in this life that leads him to his. Now, of course, he's also close to the grave, but and that often makes. I mean, when we're facing a mortal illness or something like that, oftentimes the grave looks more real to us. Or if we've lost somebody we love, we often think of life after death. But in this case, Plato wants you to see that it's very much attached to the way that he has led his life, which probably has involved some shady deals. Then the rest of the characters are several young college students. That is to say, who are they and who are you? First of all, these are all young men about your age range, from aristocratic families, from upper class families. And what does that mean? I know you guys didn't sign up for Converse University because you want to get a job as a checkout person at Walmart. You decided to go to a somewhat expensive private college or university because you have ambitions to rise in life. You want to be someone of importance and social and political, perhaps, consequence. I've had several students, again, that have said that their intention is they're going to be president of the United States. Please hurry up. Sorry, anyway. Anyway, who are these young guys, and how does that explain their conversation, and how does it explain you? It's not just that you're young people on the brink of your adult life, ready to take the reins. I asked you at the beginning of the class how many of you consider yourselves to be good and decent people, and almost everyone said you were, and that means that you've been raised to believe in the distinction between right and wrong, and that it's critical to choose the right, the just thing, the good thing, and to be a good person. Yet, just like these young people, I have to say, I remember being 18, 19 myself, and perhaps being 69 after 50 years. You wonder, well, are all these things true? Is there really a genuine foundation to being a good person? I mean, after all, if I want to be successful, perhaps I should just follow Thrasymachus' advice and climb to the top, screw everyone you can, and get it before everyone else gets you. But at least you could say most human beings have been raised with decent instincts. That's these young men. Therefore, they really do. They want to know if their society expects them to behave as a good person or justice. Is it real? Is it more than just, and you're going to see, this is what the drama of Book 2, which I'll come back to in my fourth lecture. So on one level, just a couple of comments about the other guys, and then I'll just end here because I'm running out of steam. So you're introduced to Glaucon and Adeimantus. These are Plato's real brothers, by the way. Plato's name was Aristocles, son of Ariston. And so on one level, you might say that these two brothers are Plato's presence in the dialogue, or at least to some degree. And you're going to see they're the yellow crayons in the box. They drive most of the philosophical conversation, and they're the ones that pay the best attention. Polemarchus, as we've already seen, a son of Cephalus, defending his father like a good son, and a decent guy. Polemarchus he wants to be a good person. He wants to be a just guy, and thinks he knows he's inherited from his father what justice is. But don't forget, Polemarchus also stands to inherit a fortune. So it's not accidental that his vision of justice, or his version of justice, means keeping what you got and keeping your hands off other people's property, especially mine. And again, the last sets of young people are Thrasymachus, who's a brash young sophist, as I explained yesterday, who nearly physically attacks Socrates in his fury in book 1, as I mentioned earlier, huffing and puffing and blushing. As we're going to see, I'm going to pose the question that what is anger? Although anger might be generated by several different circumstances, I'm going to put it to you that anger is actually the emotional affect or accompaniment of a sense of justice and injustice. You are angry at somebody that you perceive they have wronged you and committed an injustice. So as you're going to see, one of the reasons... sorry, just a second. One of the reasons that Polemarchus begins angry and ends blushing is because he enters the dialogue angry because he thinks Socrates is committing an injustice. So we'll come back to that. The other characters are a smattering of minor characters, the kind of college students who don't prepare for class and sit texting on their smartphones. Just kidding. And by the way, they have very little role in the dialogue except here and there. Although I will just say this, we probably won't make much of it later. In Book 5, when after Socrates lays out these great proposals for the abolishing of gender roles, for the abolishing of the private family and property and the rule of philosophers, it's Thrasymachus who says, "Oh, please continue." So his huffing and puffing at the end of Book 1 is actually converted into genuine philosophic curiosity by the middle of the dialogue. So I'll post ASAP my second lecturette in this series probably by the end of the day, or at least bye.